Welcome to the Washington Center Summer Seminar on the Global Village Beyond the Cold War. The Washington Center is a nonprofit educational organization which has operated for over 16 years in the nation's capital. Over 16,000 students have participated in its internship programs or academic seminars, such as this one, and next week's dealing with the global marketplace. The students represent over 100 colleges and universities and several foreign countries. It is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker who will look at the Persian Gulf and the lessons of the Persian Gulf, Ambassador L. Bruce Langan. Ambassador Langan is a Minnesotan and holds an MA from the University of Minnesota and has served 3 years with the U.S. Navy, 1943 to 1946. Early in his Foreign Service career, he served in Germany and in Iran. He has also served as the deputy and then officer in charge of the Greek Cypriot affairs in the Department of State. In 1960, Ambassador Langan was assigned to Karachi as political officer, and from 1964 to 1967, he served as officer in charge of Pakistan-Afghanistan affairs in the department. After a year at the National War College, he was appointed Deputy Chief of Mission in Kabul, Afghanistan. After his return to the department in 1971, he served successively as the country director for Nepal, Sri Lanka, and the Maldive Islands, and as acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East and South Asian Affairs. He was then appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary for European Affairs. He served as ambassador to Malta from 1977 to 1979. From June until November 4th, 1979, Ambassador Langan served as chargé d'affaires at the embassy in Tehran. He was among those held hostage in Tehran from that date until January 20th, 1981. From August 1981 until September 1986, he served as vice president of the National Defense University at Fort McNair, Washington, D.C. He retired from the Foreign Service in 1987 and most recently has been executive director of the National Commission on the Public Service, a nonprofit organization dedicated to strengthening the public appreciation for public service at all levels of government. We're very pleased that he's with us today, and we'd like to welcome him to the Washington Center. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Gail. You now know more about Bruce Langan than you ever wanted to know, probably. Except you don't know that I also have 3 Navy sons and 2 Navy daughters-in-law. Go Navy, beat Army. I don't see any Army in the audience. Good morning. And good morning to all of your compatriots who have been in Washington or who are in Washington under the auspices of the Washington Center, reached via C-SPAN, I gather, this morning. And that's a very good thing for them and for me, and particularly for the Washington Center. I want to add can I borrow a watch? I see it. There's a watch up there. I want to add my welcome to those that you've heard ad nauseum probably already. Well, you've been in Washington, to this city. A place once so aptly described by George Will, the columnist, as a place surrounded on all sides by reality. And that may be an affront to some of that reality out there. It certainly is an affront to Washington, D.C. I think it is a good reminder, however, that expression, that there's a lot of reality beyond the Beltway. And that's a good reminder, particularly to those of us who serve and live in this town of Washington, D.C. I've been here for now 42 years and running, and I love it. I was caught up in Potomac fever rather quickly after I came here. 42 years in and out of this place. And I suspect that many of you caught it too during the time that you've been here, or will catch it. And I would say to all of you and your colleagues, don't waste a minute of the time you've got in this town. Don't waste a minute of enjoying it, learning from it, being here in this place that in many ways, in many respects, is where the action is. You, I gather, are from all over the place. I know there's at least one of you from Washington, D.C., sitting down there in the front row, as I am. Under the auspices of this program, the Washington Center, which I have known and with whom I've worked now for some time, an organization dedicated in the way it brings you to town to the best example of public service in our country. You do come from all over. I ask almost every audience to whom I speak, whether any of you come from Minnesota, from that far out in the boondocks. Nobody here this morning? Minnesota. These other folks don't know what the heartland is. God's world out there. We share it with the mosquitoes. It's our state bird. But those who malign Minnesota, we remind them that we have a real purpose in being. Anyone here from Iowa? We're there to protect Canada from Iowa. Nobody from North Dakota? That's really far out. Not the end of the world, they say, but you can see it from there. Sorry about that, North Dakota. You may be listening. Any Wisconsin? I'm looking for the heartland, which is what it is. Is anybody here from west of the Alleghenies? Are you all East Coast? Is that correct, Gail? From where? California. That's way out. That's really way out. In the boondocks. Huh? That's as far as, well, there's Hawaii, and there is Alaska, and a little water in between. Well, I check also to find out where you're working, and not least if there's anyone here from the Department of State. I ask that because as a diplomat I want to be sure who the truth squad is out there if they're listening to me, following up on what I might have to say this morning. But I'm correct, am I not, Gail, that these folks work in a variety of agencies, nonprofits, business in Washington?
No, these are students here this year.
For the whole year?
For this week.
Just for the week? Well, forgive me. So you haven't been here long? Yes, ma'am. Washington, D.C. Super. God knows we need that these days, huh? But you're from a variety of places, including California, and I'm delighted to see you, and I'm glad you're here. You've probably heard too often this morning, or during the time you've been here, even in the short time that you've been here, suggestions from a variety of places and people that you should consider careers in public service. You are, what, seniors, juniors in college, more or less? I saw an interesting T-shirt just yesterday, by the way. You know, we're a remarkable country, the way we philosophize on our T-shirts and our bumper stickers and our license plates more than any other country on earth, perhaps. This was a T-shirt for West Virginia University, VA, and went on to say in this T-shirt, the best place to spend 5 or 6 years of your life. I said to my colleague, I thought it was 4 years that one normally spent. And he said to me, you've been out of college too long. You've been reminded about careers in public service if you haven't made a career choice. And you may be encouraged while you're here in this city, a place of considerable public service careers, to consider that kind of an option if you haven't done so already. But I will repeat my own view after now some 45 years in public service in various dimensions, currently as president of the American Academy of Diplomacy, that it's a damn satisfying way to spend your life. I've just spent, as Gail indicated in introducing me, 3 years as executive director of something called the National Commission on the Public Service, led by Paul Volcker, formerly of the Federal Reserve System, a group of prominent Americans, 36 of them, who got together to study and make recommendations on the way in which the career service of the federal government in particular could be strengthened to serve the public out there. And as Paul Volcker has often put it, public service can assure you more hours of satisfaction in relation to X number of hours of frustration than almost any other career choice that he could recommend. And he says that after some 26 to 30 years of public service. And of course, as a diplomat, I would particularly commend the Foreign Service to you. Any of you here in the audience considering that kind of an option? There's my Washington, D.C. friend again, who is considering, and you too. If you haven't made that choice, or if you've got some frustrations or uncertainty as to what you're going to consider as a career choice, may I remind you about the Peace Corps of the United States. Some of you may have run into some of them. Spend a couple of years learning a little bit more about yourself, because assuredly you do that in the United States Peace Corps. And for that matter, there is the Navy and the military services, on which you will understand why I'm somewhat prejudiced. I would go on to say, however, no one should suggest in any way, and we need some of the best and the brightest of you young people in public service in this town, in state governments, and local governments across the country, and some of you may be considering that. We can't ask for all of the best and the brightest of our young people to consider public service in government. This is, after all, a private sector-oriented country, and we need some of the best and the brightest of you there, too. But I would conclude that portion of my added remarks by suggesting to you that whatever your career choice, Wall Street, lawyers, public servants, whatever, carve out a little time. Make a commitment now that in your lives you will devote some time, X amount of time, true to George Bush's 1,000 points of light credo, to the idea of public service in some fashion in your communities across the country. But I'm supposed to talk here about foreign policy, and specifically about the impact of the Gulf War on foreign policy for this country of ours. And I want to make it clear at the outset that I'm an optimist. By nature, I'm an optimist. You can't live as a farmer in Minnesota without being an optimist. I spoke to my brother out there last night on the telephone. He's a farmer out there, and he lives in one of the 2 counties in southern Minnesota that's been declared a disaster area because of the vagaries of weather this year. It requires a lot of faith and a lot of optimism to live out there, as it does in foreign policy, for that matter. I'm not a naive optimist. I'd like to think I'm not, because that kind of an optimist quickly becomes a pessimist, and you know the old definition of a pessimist, that's an optimist with experience. I concluded, however, long since, that to begin one's life, or to begin a career with an excess amount of pessimism, is a hell of a way to start. It's a lot more fun on the trip, in my view, if you start as an optimist. And for a diplomat, one is reminded of an expression from Adlai Stevenson, who once said that optimism is to a diplomat what courage is to a soldier. And surely we have needed that at times in the Middle East. So my optimism, call it naivete if you will, as I was accused of being recently on the Donahue show when I was talking about the October surprise business, we want to talk about that later. That optimism, my naivete if you will, may come through, and I ask you to forgive me for that in my observations. In the general observations that I want to make before I get to your questions, where I think you want to reserve the bulk of your time, you and I, and our countrymen across the country, surely have lived with a very interesting time over the last several years in the current history of the world, if you will, and the current history of the experience of our country out there on the world scene, reminding me often of an expression from Arnold Toynbee A historian is supposed to have said once that history is one damn thing after another, beginning this exciting period that I refer to with the collapse, the end of that ugly symbol of despotism, if you will, the Berlin Wall. And then the revolution of 1989, running across Eastern Europe, extending most recently to Albania and other places around the world, all of which marked the end of the Cold War, the winning, if you will, of the Cold War. That dramatic series of events in the revolution of 1989, out there on the stage of world history, that saw that kind of dramatic demonstration for all the world to see, that the communist system had been a denial of humankind's quest for freedom. And then all of that followed by the drama, the excitement, the difficulties, the tragedies too, of the Gulf War and of its display of the fact that in military terms at least, there is but one superpower left on the world stage. And of course a success in that war, greatly facilitated by the very fact of the revolution of 1989 and the end of the confrontation during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. I'm not the first to remind you, I'm sure, that that Gulf War would have been a very different war, could have been a very different war, if our old relationship with the Soviet Union and its support then of the government of Iraq had been what it was. We did it well, that war, and as a diplomat, I salute. I take every opportunity I have, not least because I had two sons out there in the United States Navy, saluting what I call the uniformed public servants of the United States, the members of the armed services, the men and women, for their skill, their professionalism, their discipline, and their service out there on the front lines. We've won a war, but we have not won the peace. And winning the peace, I need hardly remind you, is not an easy aftermath of war. It is not the first time that we've reminded that it's a lot harder to win the peace sometimes than it is to win the war. Indeed, instead of a new world order out there in the Middle East, we've been reminded in recent months how much of that old world order, or at least that old order in the Middle East, remains in place. Well, what can someone say about the impact, the effects on foreign policy, on the ambiance, the atmosphere in which we conduct our foreign policy has flowed from that success in the Gulf War? Well, let me make it clear at the outset that in terms of our overall policy objectives, nothing really has changed. Our objectives, in a large sense, in that part of the world, the preservation of our relationship with the State of Israel, the assurance of a free flow of oil, the friendship in that latter context with the Arab states of that region, all of those objectives remain as much in the fore as they were before. So it is the process that we're talking about and the prospects of achieving those objectives that we're talking about. And in that context, let me put my views about the impact in terms of 10 dimensions before I get to your questions. First, and at least for the short term, there is a greatly increased sense of public confidence among the American people in how they see themselves on the world stage. We feel better about ourselves and about our capacity to exercise leadership on the world stage. And that is no small plus for the atmosphere in which this country's, any country's leadership approaches the conduct of foreign policy. A second dimension, the Gulf War confirmed in military terms what was already obvious in political terms in the aftermath of the revolution of 1989, about at least the potential for American leadership on the world stage, something that has now seen George Bush go off to his first summit in Moscow and lecture the Soviets from a stage in the Kremlin itself about their errant ways, if you will, in some dimension still in foreign policy in Cuba from our point of view. The Soviets in the northern islands demanded by the government of Japan to be returned to them in the aftermath still of World War II, lecturing them as well on the degree still of their military spending and their budget at cost to all of the economic requirements that now plague the Soviet Union so massively. A third dimension, the Gulf War surely dramatized the reliability, the utility of military power in the pursuit of foreign policy objectives. Military power as an instrument of diplomacy, if you will. Reminding me of an expression once by George Kennan, a venerable retired diplomat now up at Princeton, who immediately after World War II, you may remember, was the architect, if you will, of the containment policy, beginning with the Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs. In those immediate years after World War II, serving as the first deputy commandant for foreign affairs at the National War College here in Washington as a part of the National Defense University today. The archives of that institution record that George Kennan in 1946 said to a group of military officers in a class there, "You have no idea," and this is speaking as a diplomat, as he was, "you have no idea how much it contributes to the general politeness and pleasantness of diplomacy when you've got a little quiet armed force in the background." That was good counsel then, and it surely is today. There is no doubt that our resounding military success in the Gulf War, in the short term at least, has enormously enhanced American credibility abroad, and especially in the Middle East, where, for example, in the foreseeable future, the United States will be a major participant in military terms in the security arrangements for that region, and particularly the Persian Gulf. Our credibility abroad, and especially the Middle East, greatly enhanced by that successful use of force, and force commands respect there as it does almost anywhere else. That we have the power, that we had the power then, and we had the will to use it. And that enhanced credibility as a world leader is a very useful ingredient in the pursuit of foreign policy generally. A fourth dimension, and that is that with respect to the Middle East, the Gulf War, the pledges we made in the course of that war as to what we would do in its aftermath, and this credibility that we have won in its successful outcome, have now left us, the United States, with a heavy obligation, a heavy commitment in policy terms, a self-imposed commitment, if you will, to use that credibility in the pursuit of peace, resumption of the peace process, in particular between the Arabs and the Israelis and the Palestinians. A fifth dimension, the war and our victory in it gave us specific credibility. I spoke before about general credibility worldwide, but we earned specific credibility with all of the parties to the Arab-Israeli and the Palestinian issue. Grudging, perhaps, from some quarters, even the Iranians, and the Gaddafi in Libya, but apparently real credibility where it counts most, and that is with Syria. The current success on the part of Secretary Baker, and I use the term success, albeit that it is still early in the game, in building the basis for a peace conference, is an American show, and the Soviets are on the sidelines. And the parties know it, not least Assad in Damascus. A sixth dimension. The war clearly gave the United Nations a new status, a more positive status and stature among the American public, where in many ways it had been derided for too many years as weak and ineffective, and we shouldn't be bothered with it. The American public now has a new and more positive appreciation of the possibilities, the potential for the United Nations as an instrument, if you will, in support of American policy. And for that matter, the United Nations itself now finds itself engaged in ways out there on the world scene, and particularly in the Middle East, that it has never before seen or been involved in. And these two elements of the United Nations equation could have significant, if still unclear, implications for how we use or exploit, if you will, the United Nations in future foreign policy issues there and elsewhere on the world stage. A seventh dimension, the Gulf War and its outcome have left us as a major player in OPEC's leadership, in OPEC's deliberation, the oil cartel. A player, albeit outside the immediate councils of OPEC, but in terms of oil pricing, in the deliberations of that body, the view of the United States probably has never been stronger, and that will loom, thus, the OPEC oil pricing arrangements, for example, will, at least for the immediate future, loom less as a problem in terms of foreign policy than it was before, because of the current oil glut, and because of our current relationships, and particularly with the Saudis and the Kuwaitis, because of the absence of Iraqi oil and in the oil availabilities on the world scene. All of that leaves our relationship with OPEC stronger, and OPEC's role less a matter of concern for the United States in foreign policy considerations. An eighth dimension in the aftermath of the Gulf War for foreign policy. That war, and especially its aftermath, I think, have reminded us that respect or for support for, or that with respect to one of America's major generally defined foreign policy objectives on the world scene, that is the promotion, to the extent that we can do it, of democratic institutions elsewhere and of democratic processes of government. That objective is not one, I think we have been reminded, that is easy of achievement in a place like the Middle East. We have not suddenly seen major change in democratic processes of government in places like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, much less Iraq. A ninth consideration. I trust that the war and its aftermath, and its victory in that aftermath, have also reminded all of us, including foreign policy practitioners in this town, in the area of foreign policy, reminded us of reality, of cold, hard reality. We have not reached a nirvana if you will. We are not the world's policemen, capable of changing the dimensions of foreign policy all of that easily, despite the dramatic success in the Gulf War, despite the dramatic successes of the Revolution of 1989 in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Much, indeed most of the agenda that confronts us and the rest of the world out there on the world in foreign policy issues remain as complex and as difficult as before. Or to put it differently, there is no easy new world order out there, despite the possibilities that exist that are different and new. None of the substance, the content of problems like the Arab-Israeli issue have changed fundamentally. Nothing has changed fundamentally in the Cyprus issue, or in China, or like in GATT and the Uruguay round and dealing with international trading problems. Or for that matter, nothing has changed in some ways more difficult in what might be called the new revolution in the Soviet Union and the problems that that country is having in putting its house into some kind of new order. Some are worse, fundamentally, at least worse in terms of their appearance before us in such dramatic ways, such as in Yugoslavia and the tragedy involving the Croats and the Serbs in particular. I guess what I'm saying for you foreign policy, foreign service aspirants in particular, there's a lot left out there on the agenda for you and for the rest of us here in town to deal with. And then 10th, my final listing of this agenda, or this listing of things that have impacted on how we pursue foreign policy abroad. And that is that I think all of us should hope that the Gulf War has reminded us that strong and effective leadership and articulation of national purposes, of new ideas and sacrifices affecting the domestic agenda are needed as well. Or to put it differently, surely all of us have hoped that we could demonstrate, that we can demonstrate in some way the same kind of spirit, national cohesiveness, purpose, skill in addressing our domestic agenda as our military forces did so well in that display of a culture of competence out there in winning the war. Our strength, our credibility, our capacity, our potential in foreign policy depends heavily on our capacity in both the near and the long term to show by example that here at home we can lead as well. In every respect, in my view, the real strength of a country, of a people, of a government in power in this city, of an administration in power in this city, its real strength in foreign policy terms depends on its capacity to demonstrate to the rest of the world the very best of American purpose and success and example in dealing with our problems at home. And God knows we are not doing as well as we should. We are not doing as well as the quality of our people available to be put to the task should make it possible. Not doing as well as we should to leave something for you as young people other than perhaps the creation of a new beatitude, blessed are the young, for they shall inherit the national debt. With that, let me take your questions for about 25 minutes, whatever you've got left. I don't need applause at this point. Yes, sir. Would you tell me where you're from?
Yes, my name is Tom Higdon, and I'm from Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida. I was just curious as to your opinion. Looking back over the past 10 years in the Persian Gulf region, and now things have come up where you could almost say that we helped or nurtured Saddam Hussein and a lot of the other enemies of Iran. Seeing what we had to deal with in the end, would there have been a cheaper course of action as far as lives, money, and military strength than waiting until he finally did something like this?
I think the answer to that would have to be yes, of course. If we had lived, if we had done something differently originally, we learn from every experience. And that's part of the process of foreign policy too. We learn that we make mistakes, and we did make mistakes in our relationships with Saddam Hussein, tilting as we thought it necessary for broader strategic purposes in the Persian Gulf region in support of Iraq during some of those years of the Iran-Iraq War. And looking back on it with the benefit of hindsight today, yeah, that was unfortunate in some of its dimensions.
As a follow-up to that, then, it's been the policy of the United States, or at least it seems, to support dictators to strengthen these regional policies, you know, to prevent communism, or in this case, to combat Iran. Would you say that in the future that would still be an option for Americans' foreign policy?
I don't think it's been a given policy that we should always support X number of dictators in support of X number of foreign policy objectives. There are some instances that you can cite and that you have with respect to Iran, with respect to Iraq, with respect to some of our relationships with the Philippines where we have done that, and to our regret in the long term. I can only say that, you know, that there's a real world out there. And foreign policy implementers in particular, in our embassies abroad, for example, deal with a government in place. And they deal with the government in place in terms of the policy directives that they're given from Washington. One doesn't simply sort of set aside reality in any place in pursuing our interests abroad. Sometimes cold, hard, perceived at that moment, American national interests prevail, as we thought they did in the Iran-Iraq War, for example, when we were concerned, as we were, and to some extent rightly, with the potential for the export of Islamic fundamentalism throughout the Middle East and the instability that might result from that, affecting governments with which we were dealing and had to deal in pursuing our objectives in that part of the world. I guess I'm saying that we should learn, and I'd like to think we do learn, and we learned eventually in the Philippines, in time, to come to the support of Cory Aquino in that instance. In Iran, we came to that appreciation of our mistakes too late. In terms of our relationship with the Shah, we should have begun to change earlier. I cannot assure you that this government will forever and a day be free of any kind of record of dealing with what you call dictators out there, authoritarian regimes. We cannot change the world quite that easily, but we can learn in the process, and I hope we've learned from this one. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Craig McKinley from Ramapo College of New Jersey. I realize this lecture is supposed to be on Iraq, but I was wondering if you wouldn't mind fielding a question about Sri Lanka based on your knowledge and my personal interest. How do you feel the government or non-government there, due to the political upheaval and the different religions that are inhabited there, how do you feel that will come out, and do you feel there's any resolution?
I'll have to cop out, if you will, on that question. I have not served in Sri Lanka. I cannot speak for Sri Lanka in terms of policy objectives. The situation there today, I really don't know it. My dealings with Sri Lanka are now roughly 20 years past, when I did not serve there but dealt with it in the Department of State briefly. So I'll have to say I can't answer that question. Yes.
Mr. Torquist, University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. What do you think will be the outcome of the peace talks coming up?
What do I think of the outcome of the peace talks coming up? I don't know. I will go as far as to say that the peace conference will happen. we were very dubious about that, skeptical about. Some people are still skeptical that it will happen at all. That Mr. Baker really has in hand enough commitments yet to permit them to come to some kind of a conference somewhere. We don't even know where it's going to be yet. But I think it's going to happen. I think we have the clout, we have the credibility with the parties, as I suggested in my remarks, to almost require them to appear on the scene. We have a commitment from Assad to deal in this way, which is almost unprecedented. It is unprecedented, which is a powerful instrument. We have the Palestinians who are still not fully committed, but I find it difficult to see the likelihood, see that they have any alternative but to find some way, even given the strictures that the Israeli government has posed in that respect, to attend. As for his outcome, well, I don't think any of us should go very far out on any branches. I think it will take place. I think in terms of a general opening conference, I think the possibility of follow-on direct talks, as the Israelis insist must then result, is there. But by no means are they guaranteed at this point. It could stumble, as in previous Middle Eastern conference did in Geneva a decade or so ago, or more ago. I guess I would use the old Middle East expression in saying, Inshallah. That means God willing, as the Middle Easterners are wont to say. It will happen, and there will be some progress in a halting, difficult fashion. I don't see a repeat of the Camp David process dealing with only two countries, that is the Egyptians and the Israelis, where the president in effect hauled them off to Camp David and engineered a solution, a peace treaty eventually. It's going to be much more difficult than that, much slower, however slow that was. There is a window of opportunity, an overused expression. There are new circumstances in the Middle East as a consequence of this war affecting the Arab-Israeli issue. There is, I think, perceive a new attitude among Palestinians that they've really got to find some way to sit down with the Israelis. There is the hardline position on territory that the government of Shamir has taken, which certainly in terms of the point that we are at today is a major problem. I cannot see myself that there can be any settlement without it being based on the old concept of land for peace. I guess if I had to make some kind of guess today of what might be possible, it would still be some kind of, at best for the near-term future, a confederated Palestinian arrangement with the government of Jordan on some amount of land on the West Bank. The Golan Heights with Syria, yes, I think that's possible, that something could be arranged there, despite the tough talk being heard from Shamir about no give ever on that point. If some arrangements could be made on military security affecting that small piece of territory, and I think that's feasible, then I think there is a deal possible there. I've been going out on some branches myself and saying some of these things. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Angelina Kennedy from St. Joseph's University. Referring to
and from Washington, D.C.
And from Washington, D.C. Referring to your number one about how our confidence has increased to engage in activities on the world stage, with regards to the coming together of one European community and NATO, do you think that we should overtly exert our leadership in that instance, or should we take a step back and let them work on it themselves instead of letting it be what we want for them instead of what they want for them.
When you say they, you mean the European community?
I do.
And some of their problems in terms of dealing with Yugoslavia, perhaps?
And the coming together.
And
as
they're coming
one.
together?
Yes.
Well, I guess I would say in a general way it is for them to work that out, as they have done to date. We are not a participant in the European community. We don't expect to be. It is an entity that Europe, the countries of Europe have put together, has been evolving since the Treaty of Rome in, 1960, encouraged all along by American policy, by government statements in this country, concern expressed, yes, along the way, often, by the United States over the possibility that it will result in a kind of closed place, complicating the potential for free trade on the world scene. And that's still a problem, not least in the most recent example of the Uruguay round in trying to reduce tariffs, with the European position in particular on agricultural subsidies. There are these problems. We cannot dictate to the Europeans how they work them out. We can pressure them with our point of view. We can counsel, as we are doing. We are a participant, if you will, in other dimensions of European unity. That is the CSCE framework, where we and Canada and all of the countries of Europe are participants. We are a participant also with Europe, and thus indirectly in the evolution of a united Europe looking toward 92 in NATO. And that is an area also that has yet to be worked out in terms of future military relationships for the United States with NATO and with the European Union. All of these things have been evolving over the last couple of decades, since World War II, in remarkable ways. I have always been myself, and I think in general our country has too, been a strong advocate and supporter of the growth of a European Union, whatever the problems that might result in terms of trade, whatever the complications that might develop potentially also with respect to certain security. I'm all for it, and I'm encouraged by what's happened. Any other questions? There aren't many this morning. Yes, ma'am.
Christine O'Reilly from Villanova University. You just mentioned the CSCE, and I was just curious because you don't hear much about it, and I was just curious on your feelings with regards to that being a possible vehicle for worldwide security.
Well, I don't see it as a vehicle for worldwide security. Was not put, the CSC, the Council on Security and Cooperation in Europe, was not put together originally as a security instrument or an organization that had any kind of military clout. It was an outgrowth, a product of the evolving Western-Eastern Cold War confrontation. It resolved some of the problems affecting Eastern Europe at the time, or at least made them easier to live with, to deal with. It has evolved today into a consultative, if you will, a new consultative political organization that is unique and I think has a great deal of potential because it includes all of Western Europe and includes Canada and the United States. It's an organization that is a fledgling, if you will. It hasn't really got its feet on the ground yet. In the aftermath of the revolution of 1989 in Eastern Europe, it has new potential. But we have seen in the Yugoslav situation today that it is not that yet that can play much of a role. Potentially it may. It is more the Western European community dealing with it or trying to deal with it or trying to be helpful in resolving the problems of Yugoslavia. Yes, sir.
Tom Higdon again from Eckerd College. With Eastern Europe now coming into free market and democracies, or working towards that end, and the end of the Cold War, and now this new Persian Gulf incident, how do you perceive security in the future? I mean, obviously, at this point, you see it as military. A lot of people are talking that security in the next century is going to be in terms of economic clout. Do you think that military is still going to play that significant of a role, or will it be replaced by economic means?
I have left you with the wrong impression. I have obviously left you with the impression that our future, our security, rests fundamentally and heavily on armed force, on our military capacity to be a kind of policeman on the world stage. And I did not mean to leave you with that impression. That would be wrong. That is not my view. I was asked to speak on the immediate implications, impact in foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East, of the Gulf War and our military success there. And in the short term, there is no question but that military success, that demonstration of American power in military terms, is a powerful factor, an instrument, if you will, in furthering American interests overseas. But I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I had hoped that my last point about the power of example, and I did not address it specifically in economic terms, would have reminded you that I think our real strength is what we can do at home in setting an example, what we can do in demonstrating in that example a strong economy that benefits the rank and file of our people, that shows that we are true to the example that we set in the revolution of 1989. It was our example in that revolution, in a sense, in a considerable sense, that saw the success of that revolution. Rightly or wrongly, the peoples of Eastern Europe identified us as the kind of example that they would like to follow in terms of democratic processes and a free market. Not that we are the success that they think we are. And God knows we have shortcomings. God knows our economy is in a serious strait at the present time. I agree with you, I think, in what you were saying, that our real strength for the long term is in the economic area, particularly given the fact that there are two new major players in economic terms, or there will be, and there are today for that matter, on the world scene, and that is the European Community now, and particularly beginning in 1992, and Japan. And the other, what are they called? The tigers of the Far East and Southeast Asia. Those countries out there, Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, and the others, Indonesia, the potential that they've got and are demonstrating in putting the emphasis that they have on a free market and an economic growth. We can learn from them in that respect. We have borne a heavy burden in terms of military expenditures and the weight of those military expenditures on our budget and on our economy over the decades of the Cold War. I'd like to believe that the expenditure has been, despite the ups and downs, has been worth it in terms of the way in which that contributed to our success in confronting the Soviet Union and dealing with that threat. But I go back to what I said at the beginning. The power of our example, our real strength lies in the power of our example at home. Yes, I'm sure you would agree. Yes, ma'am.
Would you talk some about the October surprise, what it was and what your position is on it? Maybe a little bit of explanation for the students on what it was?
I guess I will forever be identified particularly with Iran and the hostage experience. Let me talk first about the fact that there are new indications today in the Middle East that your 6 countrymen, the 6 hostages, 6 Americans and 6 others at least, held in Beirut, might conceivably be approaching a day of freedom. I say conceivably, but because no one should go out far on any branches on that score. But there are some noises coming out of Beirut, as you've read in the newspapers in the last few days, and some noises coming out of Iran that suggest again the possibility that something could happen affecting Terry Anderson and others. And let me say in that respect, many of you have hung up yellow ribbons in recent months, the past year, in support of the troops, not necessarily in support of policy, but surely in support of our troops, our forces in this Gulf affair. Many of those yellow ribbons are coming down. Keep the yellow ribbons up a little while. They also speak with a sense of compassion and concern that I hope all Americans feel toward 6 Americans who have not regained their freedom, 2 of them after more than 6 years, which is outrageous, intolerable, and the most outrageous, violent example of abuse of fundamental human rights that I can cite anywhere. There is also the matter of the October surprise, which goes back to the hostage experience in Tehran. The October surprise, as some of you may know, is the term that was developed at that time in 1980 in the middle of the presidential election campaign when we were still held in Tehran. Mr. Carter was seeking re-election. He lost the campaign, and there was concern at that time in the Republican campaign headquarters that Mr. Carter might pull off what was called an October surprise, and that would see the hostages released before the election, which would have given, obviously, the Carter administration a major boost on electoral terms and conceivably have assured him another 4 years in office. The Republican campaign was obviously concerned that that might happen. And the charges now abroad in the media and elsewhere are that that concern on the part of the Republican entourage at that time extended to the point where they engineered a deal, supposedly, with elements of the Iranian government that would have seen us held and not released before the election, and thus help prevent an October surprise in return for assured arms shipments from the Reagan administration after that administration came into power in January. In the last few days, Mr. Foley, Speaker of the House, has announced that investigations will begin in both the House and the Senate, closed door to begin with, possible hearings later into these charges to lay at rest or to expand further on the possibility that those activities really occurred. I've taken the position myself, although I had no obvious way to speak. I have no way to say that I could speak to the evidence at hand at the time. I wasn't here. I've taken the position that I have seen no evidence that is sufficiently credible to me yet to support these allegations. I find it difficult, and I've been accused of being naive for this reason, to believe that any Americans in any responsible position, even in the middle of a hot election campaign, could have done something like this to hold American citizens in prison longer. If I am proven wrong, I will be sick at heart, and I think so will you. And I hope and pray that the charges are found to be unfounded. I think there is a possibility that elements of the Republican campaign at that time may have had contacts with the Iranians, but I am very skeptical that that evolved to the point of an actual deal. That's my position, and we will see what happens in the course of these investigations. How many of you, how many of you traveled abroad? A good many of you have. Are all of you seniors, or are there some less than seniors here? some less than seniors. May I say this in respect to what I've just asked you? If you haven't traveled abroad in your college years, you've missed a bet. And if you've got the opportunity, still take it. And when you leave college, as every parent has told you and every commencement speaker has told you, real life hits you in the face, and your opportunities to travel and be out there footloose and fancy-free are a hell of a lot less. And any college today across this country that does not offer its students a summer abroad or a semester abroad, I think is missing the bet in expanding the perspective of our young people across this country. That's why, for example, I also tout the Peace Corps so much, because that's another example for Americans as individuals and for American young people as a group to broaden and deepen their perspective about this increasingly small world out there. How many of you are considering the Foreign Service? I think I asked before, 2 or 3. How many of you are considering the idea of a Peace Corps tour? Anyone? There's 1. 2 or 3. As the press reports of the last few days have indicated, about 10% of the Foreign Service today are former Peace Corps volunteers. They couldn't beat us, so they're joining us. I was one of those who was skeptical of the Peace Corps when it was put in place in 1960, and I confess today that I was wrong, and I am today a stout and strong admirer of what the Peace Corps does and what the Peace Corps experience does to young Americans who have served in it. How many of you are considering government service in this town or wherever? Most of you, or a lot of you. Again, I would simply remind you it's not a bad thing. I suspect among you are some who have been reminded even after only a week here that you'd like to replace your representatives or your senators eventually. And I encourage you in that. Having had that opportunity once and not taking it, that's a choice that can be very attractive too. How many of you are sons or daughters of public officials? At least 1. But let's get back to foreign policy. Are there any other questions? Let me also, as I take the opportunity in talking to all American youth, young people audiences, get to know your immediate neighbors. 10 years down the pike, when you people will be in positions of leadership in some place or another, even in the public or the private sector, I think there are a few countries that are going to be more important to us than Canada and Mexico, our immediate neighbors. Particularly, of course, if Mr. Bush and others in both political parties have success in encouraging some kind of a North American free trade area. But also because of the obvious problems and potential of the American-Mexican relationship. It's all there, and it's increasingly in Southwest United States. Mexico is. And not least, Canada. I have a passion about Canada. I am the beneficiary, I was the beneficiary in 1980, you may remember of something called the Canadian Caper. When the government of Canada, the people of Canada helped 6 of my staff from that embassy in Tehran escape. And they made that possible, the government of Canada did, by sacrificing their entire interests as a government, as a country in Iran. Political, strategic, economic, commercial. They set all of that aside and closed their embassy and spirited 6 American men and women out of that country. If you've ever had an example on the international scene of good neighborliness, that was it. And Americans, in my view, should never forget how fortunate we are in that small respect, yes, but also in broader dimensions to have Canada and a friendly country like that as our immediate neighbor. A former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Vesey, in the United States Army, when he was chairman, once commented, this was in the middle of the Cold War, that the Soviet Union was the only country almost totally surrounded by hostile communist states. By contrast, he made the point, the United States has had the good fortune to be surrounded by friendly states, and not least Canada. And I also mentioned Canada in the context of noting that the real cartel, if you will, the real international cartel of the future may not be OPEC. It may be something called WAPEC. And that, particularly for you citizens of California, is a water cartel. And the major operative in that cartel will not be Saudi Arabia, but Canada. A lot of water up there. Yes, sir.
From Elon College.
Which college?
From Elon College in North Carolina. Could you tell us about any of the interesting or surprising findings that the Commission on Public Service found in terms of public attitudes about young people going into public service especially?
Well, it found a number of obvious truths, I suppose. Government, the American people like that government that governs least. That's a healthy attitude on the part of the American people. Has been from the beginning of our times, that we are skeptical about government, particularly about big government. And let me make it clear, the Volcker Commission, the National Commission on the Public Service, wasn't interested in promoting big government. Mr. Volcker, if anyone, is an exemplar of something else. Our concern was quality government on the job by its workforce, both career and non-career. We found, to our regret, what we had feared before, that these attitudes extended to our young people, particularly during the 80s, a decade of opulence, if you will. That's an overstatement. Young people, the best and the brightest of too few of the best and the brightest of our young people across the country were interested in public service and government. Again, I make the point, obviously not all of the best and the brightest of our young people should join government in this country. We need them in the private sector. But government needs its share of the best and the brightest, and if government is not getting it, then over the long term, we're in trouble. We found also that government was not sufficiently responsive to the needs that will be apparent, particularly in a decade or so, of drawing on minorities as they increase in size and potential in this country. So we made some recommendations in that area. We found that government was not paying its workers sufficiently, thus contributing to this lack of interest, not least on the part of young people who, coming out of college, have got a lot of debts to pay off and are pretty well often turned off and attracted instead to the private sector when the offers from government are as low or as unpromising as they are. We found that government was not sufficiently effective in training programs within government and enhancing the quality of what it had to do the job better. We found that we were reminded that government that touches Americans most is not the federal government, but state and local government, and that it is in that area as well that a good deal needs to be done to enhance its attractiveness, its efficiency on the job, and as a result of our recommendations in that area, we have several states that have put together their own commissions on public service, among other reasons, to attract young people such as you into state government and local government. There is also now a national commission on state and local government that is studying the possibilities in that area. I think I've about used up my time, but if there's any other are there any other questions? I know my successor is in the audience already. Yes, sir.
Swing back towards foreign policy. You spoke up in your presentation about the enhanced role and reputation of the United Nations. This fall, the UN will elect a new Secretary General, which will that person will most likely lead the organization through the 90s into the next century. Do you have any comment or speculation on who the next Secretary General might be, or as a fellow diplomat or anything of that nature?
No, I don't. I don't know who it's going to be. There's speculation in the press as to who it might be. There's speculation in particular that it is Africa's turn, for example, that an elder senior statesman, diplomat hopefully, I'd like to think that whoever takes over should have some feel for the practice of diplomacy. That might be the person to whom the community will turn. As you know, the choice is subject to veto of the 5 powers on the Security Council. A good deal of discussion going on at the moment, I gather, because it has to be done this fall, I believe, with the General Assembly this autumn endorsing or turning down whatever the recommendation might be. I agree with you. It's going to be it's a significant choice. It always is, because even when the role of the United Nations was less or perceived as less or seen as less, it was important today. It is much more so because of the way in which the United Nations today is involved in so many new and different ways, and its stature has been enhanced, and our attitudes toward it have been strengthened. Not regrettably yet, I don't think, to the point of paying all our debts to the United Nations. We are more in arrears than the Soviet Union as of now, but we're doing something about it if we can find it in our budget. Let me just close by saluting you again for the fact that you're here, that your commitment to service brought you to this town, that you are keeping an open mind about public service in government or elsewhere in the service of your country and in your communities. And let me say how much I envy you, not only because you're young, but also because you're young and likely and going to be participants in this country and its future over a very interesting decade, the last decade of the 20th century, a century that has not exactly set great examples in terms of some of the things that humankind have done to themselves and to each other during that time, not least the scale and potential of warfare. I guess I would say that I suspect few of you have stopped to think how lucky you are that you, 10 years from now, roughly, will be in positions of leadership from your community on up, possibly in the councils of government here in this city, at a time when this country enters the 3rd millennium of the Christian era. That's sort of awesome to think about, isn't it? And that's why I envy all of you. Good luck to all of you. Thank you.